Om Sahana Bhavatu
Avavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviriyam Karavavahai
Jasvina
Tejasvinavadhitamastu Mavedamishavahai.
Om Shanti.
Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Good evening. Today, on behalf of Hindu Yuva Purdue, it's my distinct pleasure to invite Professor Anantannad Rambachan to have a discussion or actually more of a conversation about Vedanta, about uh, Shankaracharya, and about the Vedantic discourses of Adi Shankaracharya. Just to introduce, Professor Anantannad Rambachan is a professor of religion at St. Olaf College, which is located in Minnesota, Northfield, Minnesota. And he's written several books, and he's a professor in the Department of Religious Studies. It'll be a great opportunity for us to chat with him. I want to preface this by mentioning that you have a very unique name. I have not heard the name Rambachan before. This was unique, and with with your first name being Anantannad and your last name being Rambachan, well, it says it's quite profound. The name itself. For folks who are not following along, Rambachan is the words of Ram, and Anantannad, of course, is talking about Sachidananda. So, with a unique name like that, welcome, Professor Rambachan, to this brief conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amit. And you can also call me Anant or Anand. Would be fine.
Okay.
It is very good to be with you. You reminded me when you communicated a couple of days ago that we had been in touch before, and I remembered that when you wrote to me, and you wrote a very generous letter about some of my work. So it's very good to be in touch with you again, and also to see you in person. And also welcome to all of the students who are joining us for this conversation this evening. As you know, I was looking forward to being with all of you in person, and we were planning, but then the events with the virus overtook us. But as you said a short while ago, we are fortunate we have technology that we can still make this dialogue possible and do it in a very safe way for everyone. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Professor Anant. We've been studying here at Hindu Yuva Purdue, we've been studying Vivek Chudamani for a little while, almost a year and a half. And before that, we studied Tattva Bodha. The students participate very actively in those discussions. And so this is actually the first time we've done this where we've wanted to have a conversation about Vivek Chudamani in particular and the teachings of Adi Shankaracharya. And so one of the names that obviously came up was yours. You have a very unique perspective and a very unique perch in the world to share with us. So one of the things that we wanted to hear from you, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, how and where you studied Vedanta, which school or tradition of Vedanta you belong to, who was your teacher, your guru, and how did you meet?
Thank you, Amit. And first of all, I think the students at Purdue are fortunate that you were there. And, to have someone who can study with them, texts like Tattva Bodha, Viveka Chudamani. It's very rare, and I want to say to them that they're very fortunate that you're there and willing also to teach and to study with them. As far as, some biographical details of my own history are concerned, Amit, I was born on the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean. I'm not sure how much students might know about the history of the island, but my great grandfather migrated in the middle of the 19th century. This is, pre-independence India, pre-partition India. He was 19 years old. And I have the document about the ship from which he left. He was from Uttar Pradesh, but they embarked from the port of Calcutta, around the southern tip of India, across the southern coast of Africa, up the Atlantic to Trinidad. This was shortly after the abolition of the slave trade. In 1830s, the slave trade was abolished. The British were desperate for workers to replace African slaves who no longer wanted to work on sugar plantations in all of these colonial countries, in places like South Africa, Mauritius, Fiji, Guyana, Trinidad, and so on. And India was a good source of poor labor for them. It was a very difficult time economically in northern India, a time of famine, and they recruited, young men and later on women to come to these islands under sort of a semi-slave contract. It was called indentureship. They were committed to work for 5 years on sugar plantations, after which they could return to India if they want, or they would be given a small piece of land to stay in the Caribbean or in South Africa, Fiji, Mauritius, wherever these communities were established. So, I'm about the fourth generation born outside of India. And both of my grandfathers served the Hindu community there as priests, purohitas. So I grew up in a very religious household. And after completing my undergraduate studies at the University of the West Indies, I had this very strong desire passion, I would say, to pursue religious studies in India. And, I was directed to an ashram founded by Swami Chinmayananda. It was called Sandipani Sadhanalaya. This was in Mumbai. And so I set off from Trinidad at the time when few people were traveling to India. I was very young. I just, as I said, graduated from college. And at this ashram, I met Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who was the resident Acharya at the ashram. Swami Chinmayananda ji, of course, was the founder, the head of the ashram, but he was very busy. He was always traveling. The resident teacher was Swami Dayananda Saraswati. And so, he was my primary teacher, became my guru. Swamiji Dayananda ji also had not an ashram at that time, he had a small hut in Rishikesh. And I studied with him there also. We had to stay separately at one of the local ashrams, and then we'll go over to his hut for classes. And we had classes outdoors because there were no facilities there. So I studied there with him and maintained a relationship with him for over 40 years until he died in 2015. I had the opportunity to visit him a few months before he passed away. I went to see him in Coimbatore, and it was a very emotional meeting, full of gratitude, and but I was fortunate that I could spend a few days with him, even though he was already quite ill. And as you know, Amit, Swamiji Dayanandaji belonged to the tradition of Advaita, Vedanta, of Shankara. And this was also the focus of my study. So while I was with him, we studied Sanskrit. We read the fundamental, texts of the Vedanta with the commentaries, the Bhashya of Shankara. These included the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutras, as well as other works like the one you have taught, Tattva Bodh. And of course, we also practice, various forms of contemplation that he taught under his guidance. So I was with him for 3 years, and at the end of my studies with him, after a short period of teaching Vedanta in the Caribbean, I returned to university in the United Kingdom uh, for graduate studies in religion, with his approval, with his blessings, because I wanted also to immerse myself in the academic study of religion, along with the very traditional studies that I had done. So I went on to study for my master's and my PhD degrees. And then I was offered this teaching position in the United States. And so I moved here to Minnesota from England after I had my PhD. So that's a long, I've given you a long.
Oh, that's lovely. It's a extremely cherished memory when we talk about our teachers, our gurus.
Yes.
The clarity with which Swami Dayananda teaches is mind blowing. I tell my students often, I'll digress just for a few minutes to borrow from your time. My teacher being Swami Tadatmananda, who was a student of Swami Dayananda, he was an engineer before he was a teacher and a monk. And somehow our earlier education kind of seeps into how we teach. And Swami Dayananda's command on linguistics and logic and language shows up in his teaching.
Very much.
And Swami Tadatmananda's command over his understanding of science, engineering, physics, mathematics shows up in his way of teaching.
Yes.
And I remember talking to Swami Dayananda once, and he asked me what I was doing. I was a PhD student at that time, working on my PhD in structural engineering. And I remember him telling me, "You should study with Tadatmananda." And it works out very well because the students that I interact with, since Purdue is an engineering school primarily, the students that I come across in the Hindu Yuva group are mostly students who are training to be engineers. And there's a certain way of thought that kind of appeals when I cover it from that perspective. And what is mind blowing in all of this is Shankaracharya is still absolutely to the point to all of us, no matter how our logic is set up, or how our understanding of words, of concepts, of theorems, if you will, are set up. Shankaracharya still rules in terms of being able to talk to us, which is amazing.
Yes.
And Swami Dayananda was so clear on this in his teaching. So I digressed a little bit. I'm
No,
sorry
no,
about that.
no, it's so true. Everything you said. He was an extraordinary teacher, extraordinary clarity, and a great sensitivity to words, language. How carefully a teacher should use words, because how important word choices. And just one, when I saw him for the last time, if I would have to say, he expressed some pain. He said that with regret in his voice that I can't teach again. And I could see, because his whole life was defined by his love of teaching. And he said one evening, I can't teach again. And he said it with such sorrow,
Yeah.
and pain, that it was, we were all moved when we hear him say that.
So you talked a little bit about how you came about to be at St. Olaf. Being an academic here in the United States, from my perspective, being an academic in engineering, I understand how things work a little bit. I understand what our profession calls for. I remember many years ago, I wondered whether there were people like me, but in the Department of Religion. And I couldn't find too many. And perhaps, and I may be wrong about this, but amongst the students of Advaita Vedanta, there's not a whole lot that I've come across. So when I came across you, I was very enthused by the fact that a person who is imbibed Advaita is actually a professor of religion as well. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about what what do you do in the United States as a professor in the Department of Religious Studies? And how has your original study of Vedanta influenced your work life on what you do, what you write?
Yeah.
And then, over a career spanning so long, 40 years, there must have been an overarching goal that you were working towards in your career as a professor. What was that goal? Do you think you made good progress towards it? What was the positive change you were able to bring about on a professional front from that perspective?
Thank you for that, Amit. So let me start basically by saying a little bit of what I do. So my primary teaching, as you said before, is that I teach in the religion department at St. Olaf College. So my primary teaching is, to offer courses on the Hindu tradition, and I have offered at various times sort of specialized seminars on the Advaita tradition. But I also teach courses in comparative theology, interreligious dialogue, religious diversity, and I teach in the philosophy department, Asian philosophy as well. In addition to my work, I've always kept, and it's very important to me, I've also sustained my sort of a public teaching role. So I teach regularly at the Hindu Temple of Minnesota, and give public lectures in various parts of the United States and around the world when I'm invited. A significant part of my energy is also, Amit, has been directed to interreligious dialogue and conversations for the last 25 years. I've worked consistently with some organizations like the World Council of Churches and with the Vatican. And I'm also, I suppose I would describe myself as an activist. I have a very deep concern with the role of religion on children, especially working to bring the resources of the world's religions to combating violence against children, violence of various forms. And so I lead an organization here in the United States advocating for the rights of children and especially mobilizing the resources of religion to overcome child violence. And recently I'm also involved in the Religions for Peace, which is the largest interreligious organization in our world. And recently I serve as co-president of Religions for Peace. As far as the second part of your question, a little more complex, but let me give it a try. Vedanta has had a very profound effect, as you can imagine, on my life in all of its dimensions. But you've asked about my scholarly life, and it is true what you've said, and I've been encouraging other students to pursue this part, which is I think I'm very fortunate that I was able to have a very deep traditional study in a traditional way with a guru before I went to graduate study, before I went to the academic study of religion. Maybe it would have been very different if it was the other way around. I had the traditional grounding, and then I went back to university. So even my PhD work was based very closely on the traditional studies that I did. So I was in close contact with Swamiji when I was writing my dissertation, and he read parts of it, and it was brought us together in a very special way. So I make that point to say that the major concern of my work as a scholar has been to bring the traditional methods and insights of the Advaita tradition to the academic study of religion, and vice versa also to bring the methods of academic study to the traditional methods. I've been trying to bring these two worlds, which are often very separate worlds, in conversation. So my first book, which was based out of my PhD research, you may be aware of it. It is called Accomplishing the Accomplished, the Vedas as a source of valid knowledge in Shankara, which was basically concerned with clarifying the traditional understanding of the Veda as a pramana, which I found to be completely missing in the academic study of religion. Somehow this had gotten lost. Even among the scholars in India who were writing about Advaita, the word pramana occurred very, very rarely. And yet when I was studying, this was what I was hearing all the time. So I was trying to understand how this was missing. And so this work was concerned with, clarifying and bringing the centrality of the Upanishads as pramana to the study of Advaita. So I continued that work in my other writings, like the Advaita worldview and so on. And now from the other side, I have been trying also to bring the methods of academic study to the traditional study. And let me put it in this way. Most of the students and most of the commentators on the Upanishads are renunciants. They have entered the fourth stage of life. And it was very clear to me, Amit, that this is radically consequential in this sense. The renouncer is, when you become a sannyasin, it's a very special act. It exempts you from having to perform traditional daily rituals, obligatory rituals such as worship at dawn and dusk. It frees you from that. It also frees you from all other obligations, family obligations, obligations of work, obligations of community, and so on. So it's a radical disconnection from the world as we know it. Now, I feel, and this is not clearly, we cannot understand that our location in life, or our identity in life, also deeply informs how we will read a particular shastra or text. In other words, who we are informs what we look for in the text and what we see. So naturally, the renunciant reader looks to the text solely as moksha shastra, because sole intent on gaining liberation, that informs such reading. But I feel that again, as I said, bringing the academic study, how do I do that? In two ways. I'm asking questions about the historical formation of the text. What were the social conditions also at the time in which these texts were being discussed? What was the social context of the text? And secondly, I'm asking questions about the implications of the text for life in community, which is not a question that a renunciant usually would ask. In other words, what are the implications of these teachings for economics, for law, for social, for gender relationships? Beyond the very important concern of the text as moksha shastra, can we ask what are the other implications of this text? How can this text enrich human life in all of its dimensions? No, I readily admit that I'm asking those questions because of my own identity. I am not a renunciant. I'm a teacher like you. I have a family. I'm active in my community. I'm an activist with certain kinds of causes in mind. So I wanted to know, how does the Advaita tradition speak to me in all of these roles? How does it enrich my life and the life of others who are immersed in the world? So the historical formation of the text, the implications of the text for life in the world. That's the kind of question questions I'm asking, and more recently my writings are focused on that. I've written my two recent books. One is a Hindu theology of liberation, and more recently, essays on Hindu theology. If you look at that, you'll see how those questions are making appearance in those discussions.
Thank you very much, Ananti. I wanted to say Swami Dayananda's emphasis on Shabda Pramana is unequivocal.
Yes.
Absolutely unequivocal. He's the clarity with which he talks about pramana. As a scientist, engineering scientist, I would say as an engineering researcher, the idea of a source of knowledge, of how do you draw conclusions from a given experiment, what kind of a numerical model or simulation do you perform to validate your experiment? Those things come naturally to us now in this modern tradition that I've been educated in. But it was so heartwarming to read and learn from Swami Dayananda's writings about pramana, because he talks about all of them. He talks about not just Shabda Pramana, he talks about the other five as well.
Yes.
And the best part of it is he references it all back to Shankaracharya. He says, I didn't make this up. This has been around for millennia. The idea of the understanding of the various forms of pramana. So it's amazing to listen. It is radical to a certain extent. When I heard for the first time Swamiji talk about Shabda Pramana, it took me a moment to figure out what it was that he was saying. And by minute, I mean it took me a few years of study to understand what he was talking about. And he has often talked about the fact that Shankaracharya was a sannyasi, and he was teaching sannyasi. And so you have to look at it a little bit from that perspective as well.
Yes.
And we we're perhaps at a different stage in life, and maybe we need to make sure we understand that Shankaracharya was talking to
Yeah,
sannyasis.
yeah, that was his
Uh,
topic. Yes.
so, so now that we've talked a little bit about the overarching goal and the vision that you've been working towards, if you were to take all of this knowledge, the knowledge that you've gained from Vedanta, the knowledge that you've gained by working through your career, for the students, if you can tell a little bit about what we traditionally refer to as purusharthas, the goals of human life, and in specifically, the one thing that is always um, complicated to understand is what is moksha.
Yes.
Uh, what I've found, and I tell this to my students often, is that we spend 99 years of our life asking the right question. And if I can figure out the right question, answering it is actually not that difficult. It's actually figuring out what to phrase the right question as. If you
Yes.
can tell us a little bit about purushartha, and then within that context, a little bit about moksha from the teachings of Shankaracharya and your teachers.
So, but just permit me one moment before I come to that, Amit, because I do want to just underline the importance of what you said before. Maybe we could come back to it with the students. This fact that you uplifted about the significance of pramana. It is also very true. I had read extensively, as you can imagine. Before I went to India, I was reading as much as I could get on Vedanta, and I didn't come across the word pramana. But when I went to Swami Dayananda, immediately, he immersed me in that world of the Vedas, the pramana, and this was such a striking difference from all that I had known before. So, and this is why I took it up as the topic of my PhD dissertation. Because it was so remarkable, and I continue to say that there is a very, very unique perspective here in the Vedanta tradition that looks upon the teaching as pramana. And just 2 points you're familiar with, but for the students, once you put the teaching or the text in the category of pramana, and as you mentioned, there are several other valid sources of knowledge. So along with the Shruti, you have perception or pratyaksha, inference or anumana. But there are serious implications when you put the Shruti in the category of pramana. Because what it means is that the Shruti has to satisfy the criteria of being a valid source of knowledge. For example, it must not contradict itself, or nor can it contradict what we know about reality from other valid sources. So it gives it a very high standard of proof. Shankara himself said, at one point in time, if 100 Shruti sentences in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, if 100 Shruti sentences say that fire is cold,
He does.
it cannot be true because it contradicts. So it's a very by putting it as a pramana, it demands a high level of rationality about the Shruti. And the second point, of course, is that a pramana must teach something that is unique and novel. It must not replicate or duplicate what other pramana is, or else it would be redundant. So it has a very narrowly defined sphere of authority. And that's also very important. So I'm glad that you lifted up that point, because I think in the contemporary teaching of Vedanta, I think a lot of credit, if not significant credit, has to go to Swami Dayananda and now his disciples, who are keeping alive that significant Advaita understanding of Shruti as pramana. It is found there in a very, very special way, and it has been at the heart of the tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. It blew my mind, the clarity, and as I said, the unequivocal, the force with which Swami Dayananda talks about pramana. The first time I came across it, I was blown away to a certain.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So coming to the purusharthas, I mean, just to summarize for the sake of our students, I'm sure you must have discussed this with them. So in our tradition, we visualize the whole human life, or I would say the good human life. Because this is a basic question for all traditions, what is the good life? What is the good human life for all beings? And so, the Hindu tradition has defined this in the context of the purusharthas, the four purusharthas, Chaturvid purusharthas, which include, artha, kama, dharma, and moksha. So contrary to, so many popular impressions, the Hindu tradition is not life denying. It's not so excessively otherworldly because, it's a very realistic. It recognizes the significance of artha or wealth, which also includes, power, success, social prestige. The tradition has never given its blessing to involuntary poverty. There's the voluntary poverty of the renunciant, but it has never said that involuntary poverty is somehow to be commended or it's a good thing. It has always recognized the need for basic necessities for dignified living, because you have in the Taittiriya Upanishad, the teacher says to his graduate students, "Kushalan ma na pramaritavyam." Do not be, do not ignore your material well-being. And then, and of course, karma addresses the human need for pleasure, again, emphasizing that the Hindu understanding of the good life is not life negating. It's celebration. And we love to celebrate life, all of the sculpture, music, drama, dance flourish with the blessings of the acharyas. So the good life is more than just having an ascetic minimal for survival, but at the same time, the goal of dharma speaks to the moral dimension, the relational context of human life. That we are reminded that the selfish and uncontrolled pursuit of artha and kama lead to social chaos, lead to social disharmony. That we must broaden our perspective to incorporate the good of all, what the Bhagavad Gita speaks of as loka sangra. The common good, that our rights are only meaningful and possible in a context where equal, if not greater, recognition is given to our duties and obligations to others. And that's so important that we speak of artha and kama, but only in the context of dharma, which is the broader vision of the wealth.
Right.
In other words, we cannot flourish individually if we are not also attentive to the flourishing of everyone.
Right.
Everyone else, and that's dharma. Now, at the same time, the tradition, while giving its approval, to artha and kama, in so many ways, in all of our texts, also caution us about the limits of these ends. In other words, a life that is circumscribed by these ends is a good life, but they warn us that it will be an ultimately unsatisfactory life. It will leave us wanting. And this is not a claim that is based on any kind of untested belief. It is the experience of human beings that wealth and pleasure alone will not satisfy. They are transient. They leave us wanting more. And if you're familiar with the text, we see so many accounts in the Upanishads, whether it's Nachiketas and Yama or Narada and Sanat Kumara. They all go and they say, we don't know why, but there's this sorrow. In spite of all of our achievements, there's still a sense of life as unsatisfactory. life as incomplete. And so, when one is knocking at the door of such questions, one is really knocking at the door of the fourth goal of moksha. And that's what we speak of as in the tradition as the mumukshu, the one who has come to appreciate the need for something more, and that more is moksha. It's not, and it is not an interest that is born out of failure in life. In fact, it is out of success, but
Yes.
to appreciate the limits, the unsatisfactory nature of success. It's a universal human experience across cultures and across traditions. So we can speak more about moksha if that's what you would like me to.
I think my experience has been most religions, dharmas, will talk about a goal that the sadhaka wishes to attain. And that goal, that for the sadhaka, is very unique in the tradition of Shankaracharya. It's a goal that is not otherworldly. It is not a goal that is to be attained later. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about what was Shankaracharya's explanation of what is moksha, what is the goal of human life and endeavor here and now, and how does one get there according to the tradition of Shankaracharya? Are there multiple paths, or is it one simple way of getting it? Because there's two things that are a source of confusion. What is the goal, and how do I get there? If I define the goal incorrectly, then it doesn't matter what paths I take. I'm going somewhere which is not my destination. And on the other hand, if I know the goal, I may be taking not the correct path. So within the tradition of Shankaracharya, the two, if you could expound on that.
One of the many things that I appreciated about Swamiji as a teacher, Amit, is that he made moksha a very accessible goal. And you hinted at that in your opening comment just now, because the Advaita tradition speaks of moksha as something to be gained here. The idea of jivan mukta, living liberation. So it is not a liberation concept that is only realized after death, but the fullness of life is to be achieved here and now. And he made that, by the way he taught, something very accessible to the student who was deeply interested in it. So to put it briefly, the Advaita tradition, and we see it again, in so many of the encounters in the Upanishads, teaches that this fundamental human desire for fullness of self, for self-adequacy, self-completeness, however we might call it, this is resolved by overcoming what the tradition speaks of as avidya. So if you ask the teacher, what is the fundamental human problem? The answer in a single word will be, it's a problem of avidya, or ignorance. Right? And that ignorance is ignorance about who you are, about the nature of the self. Now, one of the very important dimensions of understanding moksha in the Advaita tradition as as Shankara himself says so carefully in various parts of his commentaries, is that the problem is not to prove the existence of the Atma. It is the most self. It is because its existence is self-evident, and that is contained in the deep and sense that we all have. I am. I exist. That the reality of one's existence is self-evident. One doesn't have to prove one's existence, and that fact is the Atman. It is self, as we say, it is self-shining. It reveals itself, so that the self is not subject to proof. But what it is, that it is, does not have to be established by any pramana, because all pramanas depend on the existence of the self. It's prior to all pramanas. So that it is not subject to proof. Where the dispute is what it is. What is its nature? Is it identical with the body? Is it identical with the mind? What is its relationship with the rest of the universe? And so on and so forth. So this is the role of the pramana, not to establish that the self is, but to teach what it is. What is its nature? Because, and here is where this issue of vidya comes in. There's a sort of a natural, native orientation or tendency to identify, the self fully with the body, the mind, and so on. So the process of teaching basically is to correct false understanding and to point to the truth of the self. So Shankara and Advaita on the whole, because it describes the human problem to be one of avidya, it has emphasized that the primary means to the overcoming of avidya is jnana. So it is primarily a way of knowledge. But we must always be careful, when we speak of knowledge, not to think of knowledge as a superficial knowledge of words. Knowledge is a discipline. Knowledge is a discipline in Advaita. It is a process of transforming one's understanding of oneself. It's a very deep process, and that knowledge, as in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, is described as the threefold process of Sravana.
Listening, Manana, Nididhyasana.
Yeah. So each of which is, it's a very demanding. We speak, in the Advaita tradition, we speak of jnana abhyasa, the practice of knowledge,
right?
The discipline of
absolutely
knowledge, practice of knowledge, through which we come to liberation or moksha is a very clear understanding of the nature of oneself. And I even hesitate to say this self because it tends to objectify the self. The nature of oneself,
right,
to be a full, complete, adequate being, which is to say, as the Upanishads teach in the Mahavakyas, that Atman is Brahman. To say Atman is Brahman is to say that you are the full being that you desire to become, and that is the fullness of every being.
So I like to use the word Purnam. Because there's such a nice Shanti mantra that we will probably do at the end. Everybody knows so well. Yes. And so I can't find words in English that can adequately represent the feeling of being Purnam.
Purnam, yes. So that's a beautiful word which, describes the completeness, the fullness of the self, fullness of being that we are, you are, that I am. And understanding that and owning oneself to be that, living a life from that vision of self-understanding, whatever one's role in life might be, as a teacher, as you are, as a professor in a college, as a husband, as a member of the community, living a life from that center of fullness is
Yeah.
what liberation is.
Yeah. So well said. And I want to emphasize Jnana Abhyasa. At the local temple, I teach Bhagavad Gita on Sundays. We
Yes.
just completed chapter 12, and you know how clear Bhagwan Sri Krishna was on his emphasis on Abhyasa.
Yes, sir.
Because he, Arjuna asked, "How do I get there?" And his answer is Abhyasa. You
Abhyasa.
have to.
Countena. Yes. Abhyasa, abhyasa. And, you know, as we in the tradition, Amit, we speak of, different kinds of students, the Uttamadhikari, the highly qualified student, who has long practiced the disciplines of, as Tattva Bodha outlines, sadhana chatushtaya, rich in sadhana chatushtaya. Has undergone a long process of self transformation in preparation for this teaching. But for most people, the jnanam I would describe more as a process. In other words, in spite of understanding, there are still deeply ingrained habits in our minds. We speak of that in the tradition formally as vasanas, long ingrained habits that are still contrary to the wisdom about the self that we have come to learn from the Shastras. So these often erupt into the mind.
Right.
So therefore there is this necessity. This is where manana, nididhyasana come into significant, that we have to do that abhyasa.
Right.
That abhyasa is a sadhana of trying to form the mind, to mold the mind in harmony with with what one is truly is, so that there is the dispositions of the mind are harmonized with the fundamental nature of the.
Sometimes I try to remind my students on the complexity of knowledge itself. My teacher, Swami Tadatman, used to give this example, and it sat very well with me as an experimentalist myself. We all experience a sunrise and a sunset every day. Every day we go out, we look at the sunrise, we look at the sunset, and it's beautiful. But knowledge tells me that the sun does not rise. Neither does it set. It is us who are rolling over backwards, and to us it looks as though the sun is rising and the sun is setting. And in spite of gaining that knowledge, I can still enjoy the sunrise.
Yes.
And still enjoy the sunset. And every night Ishvara will give me another beautiful view of the sky. He'll say, yes, the sun is not setting, but look at the sky.
Yes.
Absolutely gorgeous. And internalizing that knowledge, which sometimes is not easily supported by experience.
Yes.
Is the complex part of understanding and gaining that knowledge, and somehow I call it percolating it down from the head into the heart.
Yes.
Is a long process. That's the process of sadhana, the practice.
Yes.
Very, very beautifully said.
That's quite true. And as with Bhagavad Gita, I always remember this important verse of second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. I'm sure you will recollect it, Amit. Yatato api kaunteya purushasya vipaschita. Even among the best, purusha vipaschita. He says, even among the best, yatato api kaunteya purushasya vipaschita. Indriyani pramatini aranti prasabham manaha. Can sweep away. The inattentive, the unmindful can be swept off by these, well-established tendencies of the mind. In other words, it's a call for vigilance. Again, coming to that abhyasa. Abhyasa is vigilance.
Yes. Very good. So I think we are at about a point where I should take a few questions from the audience. I think I have a few questions that were forwarded to me by the students.
Okay.
One of them is actually you've touched upon it, so you'll be able to talk about it a little bit more. One of the students is asking that as per the Advaita tradition, I understand what is to be gained. I understand that I gain an understanding of the self, of Brahman. He says, how do I use it? How do I use this knowledge of this? You actually touched upon it a little bit when you were talking about the purnatvam and the actions of the being that emerge from a place of purnatvam are different than the actions that emerge for the being who's not quite yet, who's a little bit lost in their ragas and dveshas. So I think that's what the student is asking. How should I use the knowledge?
Yeah. I think there are several ways to think about this question. It's a very good question because Shankara himself used to speak very often in his commentaries on what I would identify, Amit, as the fruitfulness of knowledge. As evidence for the teaching of the Shastra, sometimes he would point to the transformed life of the liberated person. So I call that, the fruitfulness of the teaching. And I think I see this question in that context. And I would say that primarily I would point to two dimensions. One is that I would point to the fact that this knowledge resolves the most fundamental of human needs, which is the need for self-fullness, self-adequacy. Right? And that's a very practical, that's a very, as practical as it can get. Now, one of the outcomes of this knowledge also, as Shankara himself says, I'm thinking of Guru Stotram, Mannatha Sri Jagannatha, that the Lord that I worship is the Lord of the universe, Madatma Sarva Bhutatma. Tasmai Sri Guruve Namah. I bow to that teacher because of whom I've come to recognize God I worship, Jagannath is the Lord of all. But secondly, Mad Atma Sarva Bhutatma. That I myself is the self of all. And that is a very radical teaching.
Oh.
What we can ask is, what are the implications of seeing oneself fully present in everyone else? The implications, as enunciated in the Advaita tradition, we speak more about daya, compassion for others. There is a very beautiful section of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad where you may remember it, Amit. These students have studied with their teacher and they are leaving, and they all come and say, Guruji, what is your final teaching? What is your final teaching? And that's where he says the da. It says da. He says, my final teaching is da. Then the first group goes and he says, think about it. And they go and they think about it. And they said, Guruji, you said Dhamma,
Yeah.
control. Huh? And then then the second group goes, give us your final teaching. And the teacher says, duh. And they go and they think about it. And they come and they say, Guruji, you said, Anam, give, be generous, share. Eh? And then the third group comes, he says, duh. They go and they think and they come back and they said, you said to us, daya,
Daya.
be compassionate. So compassion, generosity, self-control, freedom from greed. These are all outcomes of this knowledge that are very significant for life in our world.
Yeah.
Our world, I think, to answer the student's question, our world is longing for not for leaders, but also for human beings who are compassionate human beings, caring human beings, generous human beings. And this knowledge, the fruit of this knowledge manifests itself in those kinds of virtues. Those virtues are the highest fruits of Atma Jnana, of self-knowledge. So yes, live in the world on the basis of the richness of this wisdom. If we look at history, another practical aspect of this, Amit, if we look at history and we study the history of conflicts across our globe, one thing is consistently true, is that as a precursor to violence, there is always the rhetoric of distancing oneself from the other. In other words, saying that the other is not like me.
Yeah.
I am different from the other, demeaning the other, demonizing the other, distinguishing oneself from the other. That becomes the context, the pretext then for violence. The alienation from the other precedes the ability to hurt the other, because at some fundamental level, it is still difficult for us to hurt someone in whom we see ourselves. So we have to distance ourselves in order to hurt. Advaita overcomes that. An Advaitin truly, if he or she understands Advaita, as you had said before, you used the example, the movement from the head to the heart. One for whom Advaita is both, brings together the heart and the head, or the head and the heart, cannot but speak for the well-being of all, cannot but act for the well-being of all. So that's why I would point to this question.
Thank you very much. It was a, I think, complete answer. Then basically, so far I have I have a question that's a little more on the, I would say a little bit more on the political side, but I'll paraphrase it in a way that you can address it.
Okay.
And Swami Dayananda has actually talked about it, how the tradition of Advaita and this understanding of compassion, charity, and self-control produces a human being who's going to be contributing to the welfare of all. How do we communicate this out to the world that this is a tradition to be followed, while not hurting their sensibilities? Because the first kind of violence is to hurt someone's beliefs or sensibilities. So how do you communicate the knowledge of the Hindu tradition, the knowledge of the Advaita tradition out to the world without hurting other people's sensibilities?
Yeah. It's a very good question. And in a sense, it's a question for all religious traditions. how do we share the deepest resources of our traditions in ways that are not, as you said, ways that are non-hurting, or even in ways that are not arrogant, um, and demeaning of others. And I think that this is one of the reasons that I have given so much of my energies and continue to do amid to interreligious dialogue, which I define as a conversation of, primarily as a conversation, even though it's not limited to conversations, but conversations of mutually giving and receiving, conversations of giving and receiving. So when we come into dialogue, we have to be faithful to the visions of our traditions. We must not be fearful of sharing the visions of our tradition, the core claims, the core affirmations of our traditions. But we do that in a way that is respectful, dialogical, and with openness to receive what the other might also has to give. Now, there are very good resources for that. If you take, for example, I see that kind of sharing as very consistent with what the Bhagavad Gita, spoke of as the discipline of speech. You speak the truth, Satyam, but you speak the truth, Priyam. Right? Priyam is you speak it in a way that is pleasant, not demeaning to the other. You speak it with the intention of Satyam, Priyam, Hitam, with the intention of benefiting the other. And also, of course, it's ahimsa, Satyam, Priyam, Hitam. Those are the very good guidelines for interreligious sharing. But if you approach the other, with the arrogant attitude that I have something to give but nothing to receive. Gandhi, in fact, in the early 20th century, he said to Christian missionaries in India, you cannot come to this land to give without receiving. You cannot come here to give without receiving, because this land also has something to give to you. And if you open your hearts, you will be enriched. So, we cannot share meaningfully in a context of monologue. It has to be a context of
absolutely
dialogue. Without at the same time, if we are not faithful to what we affirm, also, we have nothing to share. If we just take the position.
Oh, so well said.
Yeah.
If we are not Purnam, what are you going to share? I don't need a fragment of you. I want all of you.
Yes. What can you share? Exactly.
Very, very, very nicely said. Because when you're in love, you need to share all of yourself.
Yes.
I don't want fragments of you.
No.
And you can only be in love if you yourself are in Purna. You are available to me.
Yes.
And compassion and love are amazing venues through which sharing can occur. I completely agree. Very, very beautifully said. How can you share if you're not yourself?
And I think one final point, Amit, is that good relationships of sharing are built also on the basis of trust. In other words, the best experiences of mutual learning occur in relationships of trust, relationships of friendship. And in those relationships, if you and I become very good friends, let's for a moment forget the religious dimension of our conversation. I feel safe, I feel secure, as you said just now, to give myself fully to you and to also receive yourself fully. I feel safe to ask you questions and to also receive your questions, because I don't have the fear or the suspicion that you are seeking to undermine me by a question that you ask, or you feel somehow threatened personally, because we trust each other. We have formed a relationship of trust, which makes this experience of mutually giving ourselves and receiving the other meaningful and fruitful and joyful, as you indicate.
This is great. I think we covered quite a few questions also from the students, and we had a great discussion. Any parting remarks or concluding? I mean, we'll do our Shanti part in just a moment, but any concluding remarks or any aspects?
There's one point, Amit, that I'm thinking a lot about recently in my writing on Advaita. You had one of the questions, and I'm not going to go into it, but just to say that the word Advaita literally means not to, right? So it occupies a really interesting space between saying, it describes a relationship. It describes a relationship between the Brahman and the world. And it doesn't say simply that they are one, and it doesn't say simply that they are two, but it says not two.
Yes.
Not two. Now, so I have been pondering quite a bit, how can we tease a little more, unpack not two, and how is it different from saying a relationship is one or two? So for this reason, I don't describe Advaita as monism, although that's a word in English that's often being used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Monism. And then with monism, you get this description of the Hindu tradition as affirming pantheism.
Right.
And of course, it is not dualism also. It is neither monism nor dualism. It's Advaita. And there's something very rich in describing that relationship as not two. And so that has been something that has, I've been thinking a lot about and starting to write about. The second point I want to make also, which I've been looking at carefully in my work, one of the big conversations in our tradition, Amit, is the tensions, I would say, and sometimes even the hostility between the Vishishta Advaitins, the Ramanuja's tradition, the Vaishnava Vishishta Advaitins and Advaitins, even onto today. So for example, if you read, say, the Bhagavad Gita commentary of, say, Prabhupada, for him, the big enemy is the Advaitin and Shankara.
Oh.
Yeah. So I have come to see, that a lot of what Ramanuja was responding to, because he was 11th century, Shankara was 8th century. A lot of what Ramanuja was responding to and found very difficult in Advaita were certain developments, what I call post-Shankara developments in Advaita, which are not necessarily present in Shankara. I give you one example and I will stop. So one of the big issues for Ramanuja is this issue of Maya. And clearly something happened between the 8th and the 11th century where Maya was, or even Avidya, was made into a concrete reality. And so he was asking, how could Brahman possess Maya? And how could avidya be an attribute of Brahman, and so on. Whereas Shankara did not really describe Maya or Vidya in that kind of positive way, as a positive existence, as having some kind of bhava. So I would like to devote some more of my energies to this kind of trying to clarify some of these intra-religious differences, especially between the tradition of Ramanuja. It's a very important tradition for us, and the Advaita tradition, to sort of bridge these gaps of misunderstanding, because I think these traditions are much closer to each other than these disputes sometimes might um, reveal them to be. And so at the heart of it, so for example, another one is that they are saying that Advaitins describe Brahman as impersonal. So they make the distinction between personal and the impersonal. And so that's because, nirguna is wrongly translated as impersonal. Whereas the word nirguna, if you just think of the Sanskrit meaning, has nothing to do with personal and impersonal. It simply means
right,
without gunas,
yeah,
or free from the gunas. So they say, their Vishishta Advaitins say, oh, you Advaitins represent Brahman as impersonal, whereas we see Brahman as Ishvara, as personal, as Vishnu. But I think it's also based on a misunderstanding of Shankara. Shankara was also a great devotee.
I'm reminded so much of the teachings of Swami Dayananda while I talk to you. He has talked about this at length in his teachings too. And it's a funny anecdote, but I started my studies in Vishishta Advaita.
Oh,
so I came from there.
I wasn't aware of that.
And it was fascinating to me. The Mayavadi is the
big
bad guy.
Yes.
The big bad guy. And I don't know whether it was a teaching procedure or not, and I don't think about it anymore too much in that context. I asked my teacher once a little bit about it, and he put it in a way that helped me understand, helped me make my peace with it. He said, Amit, you got to remember, you got here somehow, and you can't pull the ladder behind yourself. So leave it alone. Leave it alone, because if you understand what is being talked about, what Shankaracharya is teaching, then you will realize that you can leave things be and make your peace with them.
Yeah.
I thought that was very compassionate, because it let my heart be relaxed. And in terms of parting remarks, I know Swami Dayananda used to teach this, because Swami Tadatmananda used to talk about him, and Swamiji always used to say, there is not one God in Hinduism. There are not 484,000 gods in Hinduism. What people don't realize is that there is only God in Hinduism. Everything else is subsumed by this Ishvara, who has the ability to possess Maya and is continuing to remain untarnished with it altogether.
And that's why I think, the way you put it there, I mean, from all of my reading of the Vishishta Advaita tradition, is they would not argue with an understanding like that. That the word Maya simply describes the ability of the one to become many. It's just a term that describes, but doesn't describe Maya as an attribute or
right.
It's simply to describe this inexplicable Shakti of the one to become many. I agree with what your teacher said about it. It is, I mention it, it's just because I'm in conversation with many of the Vaishnavas and many of the Vaishnava scholars, and I just feel that often when they speak of Advaita, I don't recognize the Advaita that they speak of. I don't recognize it. And I think, yeah. like you would agree. And so I said, I just feel a need, we really need to build some conversations and maybe revisit in the same spirit that the student that asked the question, how do you share?
Right.
But when I'm thinking of sharing, we must also think of this intra-religious sharing, intra-religious dialogue. But that's it. I really enjoyed very much. I can't see the students, but I hope they all benefited from this conversation between Amitji and myself, and hopefully I can come to Purdue sometime.
Yes, that would be very much. Once things settle down a little bit, that remains pending.
That would be wonderful. I look forward to that very much. Great to see you, Amitji. You keep well and safe, you and your family. Shivram, thank you very much for making this possible. And I look forward to being with all of you.
So we'll end with our Shanti Path.
Please.
Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.